story about Joseph being, what's the word that I want to use here? Potiphar's wife was trying to get to Joseph, and he resisted, didn't he? He lived faithfully. He did not give in to the temptations of that, and he did not sleep with Joseph's wife, or with Potiphar's wife, which is a good thing. But what we didn't learn last week is that Potiphar's wife actually accused him of raping her, of sleeping with her, and he did end up going to prison for that. So even though Joseph did nothing wrong, he did end up going to prison. So you got to think about this guy Joseph, right? And I think I have a map. Maybe it's not the best map, but I did find a map. It's super blurry. Bear with me here. But this is Joseph's life journey of kind of what we talked about last week. And I just want to kind of recap us for a little bit here. So Joseph is the favorite son of 12 sons, right? He is his father's favorite. He's living in blessing. He gets all the best things. He's got a good life. He's got a really good life. But Joseph has these dreams. He's a dreamer. And basically he's like, hey, what my dreams are telling me is that I'm going to be supreme amongst all these brothers. Like, you guys are going to bow down and worship me. And like Laura said, like, that's not a really great thing to hear from your little brother. So all of his brothers were like, who does this guy think he is? Like, this is ridiculous. So when Joseph leaves to go out, his brothers follow him, and they capture him. He's kidnapped by his own family, and he's actually thrown into a pit. So already in Joseph's life, this guy goes from living great to living in literally a pit. But it gets worse. There's this caravan that comes by, and Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, and they tell his father that he died in a hunting accident. So his father thinks that he's dead. His brothers go back home. Joseph's on his way to Egypt to be sold into slavery. When he gets there, he is sold into slavery. But in God's favor, God brings him up into this guy named Potiphar's house. So Potiphar is like second in command almost behind Pharaoh. He's the captain of the guard. Basically what that means is that he is the leader of the military for the Egyptians. And he's living in luxury. So already, you see this guy, he's going from way high highs to low lows, back to high highs, back to low lows. So he's living in luxury in Potiphar's house. And all of a sudden, this situation with Potiphar's wife comes into play. And now he's going to go to prison. He's going to go to prison because he's falsely accused of something that he didn't even do. So Joseph's life is a train wreck. I mean, this guy's a roller coaster, right? High, low, and now he's sitting in prison. And he's like, what the heck am I doing in prison? And that's where this story picks up in Genesis chapter 40. So that's where we're at. You guys see this? He's down there in Egypt. And I'm going to read just a couple verses for us. So if you have your Bible open to Genesis chapter 40, we're going to start in verse 1. And here's what it says, okay? He's sitting in prison. He's been there for a little while. Here we are. Verse 1 says, sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord and the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with his own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with them in custody in his master's house, why are your faces downcast today? And they said to him, we have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. And I'm not going to read this whole thing for you, but basically what happens is, so Joseph just noticed, hey, these guys are downcast, these guys are sad, what can I do to help you? And he's going to say, well, hey, I know God, I know Yahweh, the King of heaven, and dreams and interpretations of those belong to him. Let me interpret these dreams for you. So you notice already, Joseph's not taking credit for this. He's not saying, oh, I know all the answers. But he's giving credit to God. And something about the Egyptian culture would be, they were very into dreams. They were very into the interpretation of dreams. But their interpretation involved things that were not so pure, right? They were into things like divination, which is sorcery and conjuring up the dead and black magic. And they would use all these different tactics to interpret dreams. But Joseph says, no, that's not how you do it. God is the one who gives the true interpretations of dreams. Let me tell you what God has to say. And he's going to go on and he's going to interpret these dreams. And basically what happens is one of their dreams, he tells them, hey, Pharaoh is going to lift you up. There's going to come a time and a day when you're going to be lifted up and you're going to actually be set free from prison and you're going to go on to do great things in the kingdom of Egypt. To the other guy, I think it's the baker, he says kind of the opposite. He's like, hey, you're going to go down. He's like, actually, you're going to be killed by Pharaoh in a day to come. And what comes to pass is that actually, I don't want to get too ahead of us in the story, but these things come to be true. His interpretations are correct, but he says one thing to them before he sends them off. And I'm talking about Joseph here. He says, hey, just remember me when Pharaoh comes to you and these things actually happen. Tell him who interpreted your dreams. Tell him that I'm the one that told you these things so that I can find favor in Pharaoh's eyes and that I can also be set free from this prison that I shouldn't even be in right now, right? So time goes on. Of course, when these things come to pass, they forget. But in just the right time, they remember him, and they do tell him. And I don't want to get too far ahead, like I said, but he will eventually be set free from this prison. So I have a few points for you, basically in this story. Okay? And I think I have a slide for the first one. What does it say here? Okay. God's plan is not always what we expect or want it to be, but it's always exactly what we need it to be. So God's plan is not always what we want it to be or what we think it should look like, or we have this plan for our lives or the situation that we're in. Oh, this is how it's going to work itself out. Many times, that's not how it goes, is it? But if we remain faithful like Joseph remained faithful through all of these highs and all of these lows in his life, it's exactly what we need it to be. And that's what I really want to talk about that for a second, because we just talked about Joseph's life. We just talked about this guy, and when I think about Joseph, I think about a guy who is faithful and obedient. Those are the two words that come to mind as I'm studying this passage, as I'm reading it. Faithfulness and obedience. Faithfulness and obedience. And these two things kind of go hand in hand, don't they? If we're living faithfully, we're likely going to live in obedience to what God expects from our lives, right? And our whole Christian faith is founded upon this idea of faith. We are saved by faith alone through grace, or grace alone through faith. And have you ever thought about what it means to have faith? Do you ever thought about what it looks like to have faith in God? If you have faith, if you have a belief, if you have a conviction in your heart and your mind of who God is and what He expects from you, then likely you're going to live faithfully, right? That's how it shows itself out. That's how it reveals itself. And that's exactly what we see in the life of Joseph. Joseph, like we just said, let me take you through his story just one more time. He goes from being the favorite son in his father's house to literally being thrown in a pit by his own brothers and sold into slavery, to going back up to being one of the leaders in Potiphar's house, one of the chief officials of Israel, living in luxury, to then again being falsely accused of something that he didn't do with Potiphar's wife and being thrown back into prison. So he goes from high to low to high to low. And throughout the entire story, Joseph's faith remains constant. It's not like he's living one day, he's rebelling against God. The next day, he's serving God amazingly. No. His relationship with God has been consistent throughout the story. So his circumstances are not not dependent on how he's serving God. His circumstances are not dependent on how good he's doing as a human being. And think about that for your own life for a second. Sometimes we get caught up in these situations that are difficult for us, and we think, oh, God's punishing me. Or why is this happening to me? Or am I doing something wrong? Or has God abandoned me? Is God not being faithful to me in this situation? But many, many times, and I'm not saying there's not consequences to our sin, there's not consequences to our actions, but many, many times, it has nothing to do with these situations. There's many stories in the Bible of men and women who live faithfully, who are living consistently in their relationship with God, and yet find themselves in great situations and in very bad situations, right? And God will allow us to go through different trials, different temptations, to build us up, to strengthen us, but also to work through us, right? He goes into this prison, and he's able to reach the baker and the cupbearer, and if he was never put in that prison, he would never reach those people. So this is what I mean by our plan maybe is not what God's plan is or what we think it should be, but it's always exactly what we need or the people around us need, right? So we can learn from Joseph. We can remain faithful. We can remain consistent in our relationship with God in order that God's plan gets accomplished through our lives, right? God's plan can get accomplished through our lives. Let's go on to the second point today. This is the last point for us. And like Joseph, we should be willing participants in God's plan. So another thing I think about when I think about Joseph is this idea of selflessness. Selflessness. The opposite of being selfish. And think